To join Council Chairman Mr. Sam Allen, please welcome the Council's University Vice Chair, Dr. Mike Crow, President of Arizona State University. The Council's Industry Vice Chair, Dr. Mehmood Khan, Vice Chairman and Chief Scientific Officer of Global Research and Development of PepsiCo. Mr. Jim Clifton, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Gallup. The Council's Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Chad Holliday, Chairman of Royal Dutch Shell. Dr. Keoki Jackson, Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Lockheed Martin. Dr. Paul Kearns, Director of Argonne National Laboratory. And Mr. Rich Penkowski, U.S. Consulting Clients and Industries Leader, Deloitte Consulting. To share his perspective on critical competitiveness trends affecting the ability of the U.S. to compete and prosper in today's
The voice of God has gone away. I think he was referring to me, so without a name. And so Michael Crow. And so what I wanted to do, Mahmood and I will just kick off just a couple of comments each about the commission and where we're hoping to go. And for the other panelists, of which there are many, what I'm hopeful of, or what we're hopeful of, is that each of you can respond to the basic design set of questions. One thing I'd like to say is that if we approach this commission from the perspective of, it's all about the lack of government investment in science and technology spending, or it's the inadequacy of the science, technology, engineering, and math pipeline, and that our national competitiveness is somehow linked to the same old arguments. I think that we will put another report at the end of the commission onto the pile of all the previous reports, and we won't see much action. And so what I'm hopeful of in this commission as we evolve this and roll it out is that we can take a very serious look at the design of our competitiveness framework within the United States. We have probably long ago passed the design limits of the previous structure. We have a historically successful, but going forward, not highly performing educational sector. That is, it's very uneven. We're not well prepared for producing what I call master learners going into the future at the rate of change that our society is presently experiencing. We've got a drag on our economy by two very, very expensive sectors that in the Gallup polling data, and Mahmood will talk a little bit more about this, we have a very significant drain on the economy. We have a higher and higher percentage of the economy being devoted to three sectors, healthcare, education, and housing. Set housing aside as something that market forces have more substantial control over, and look at the cost and underperformance in terms of outcomes anyway, particularly equity outcomes within healthcare alone. We're eating up more and more and more of our economy by providing services that fewer and fewer people can take full advantage of because of their costs. Now, that might not sound like something related to competitiveness, but it turns out that it is. And so when we talk about design, or at least when I'm talking about design, we can only approach this broad question of national competitiveness if we look at the structure of the economy, if we look at the structure and the rate and the flow of innovative processes, if we find a way to rethink the design, and if we find a way to do something else, which is that we are constantly turning to the government for all of our solutions. Clearly, the government has an important role, but it's just a role. What we haven't yet done is figured out how to solve some of these things that lead to 4% economic growth being a low number over which everyone is discouraged, looking at immigration as a necessity for the enhancement of the labor pool in the United States and the continued growth and evolution of the economy of the United States. So you've got all these factors working, but we keep compartmentalizing it. We keep suggesting that it's a function of a few policy shifts, a few votes, a few additional dollars to this or this or this, when it's not. So when Mahmood and I have talked about this, we've talked about taking an approach of this commission, and this is what my comment is to the other panelists. Let's go back and look at the fundamental structural design of all things that lead to us being more or less competitive, including those things that are drags on the economy itself. Mahmood?
So let me just build on that. And as Michael and I have been discussing how to move forward here, you look at the study that Gallup did a couple of years ago and published. We've gone from spending about 25% of American household income to about 36% now on those three categories, right? And Jim, you've talked about this in the past. But an important part of this productivity equation is value and equity. You can spend more, but if the return isn't there in a proportional manner, we're actually going backwards. So you can look at this, as some have done, as a cost-cutting, let's just take pieces of expense out, but not thought about this systematically. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to look at this system-wide. And let me give you an example. If we're spending increasing amounts of money on healthcare today, and then you couple that with a population whose demographics, frankly, are changing, we're going to have more people in older age brackets. That isn't just a US problem, by the way. It's happening in China, it's happening in Asia, it's happened in Western Europe, it's happening in Japan. And so there's an actual global challenge that healthcare costs will continue to go and society can't afford it. Everybody's brought this up. Innovation is a key enabler. And innovation to me is not inventing another widget. Innovation to me is taking the inventions often that already exist and in a systematic manner optimizing the system to leverage them. And what we haven't yet figured out as a society is how to leverage all of this and then move our focus. Parallel that with the workforce where we now have a disparity between the skills we need and the skills that the workforce has. And we're going through this transition, and that's where it's not just government, but with all due respect, it's the academic institutions, it's how we train people. Even the workforce that we're preparing, as an industry leader, as a scientist, the average age of an industry scientist across all industries is over age 50 now, here in the United States and in Western Europe. So within a decade, half of the scientific know-how and workforce of this country's industrial base of R&D, which is the largest spend, is going to retire. We have no idea where we're going to replace this. So the innovation equation has to be paralleled then, therefore, with the right policy, the right educational focus, and then the investments, and of course, ultimately, keep the population healthy. So let me given the context that Michael and I just set up, so our job was to ask the questions. We have all the brain power sitting to the right here who are going to help shine light to this. So as you think about this, what is it that we can focus on in this commission to actually not only write the paper, but actually make it into actionable ideas that get implemented?
And then think at the design level, not just the single policy level. What do we need to do at the design level?
Sam, you want to kick it off as chairman and then hand around?
Sure. First off, I think it's just great that the two of you are leading it. You know, to have a commission be successful, you need great leadership at the top. And I think the two of you are absolutely the right two people to help steer all of us in our thinking on this. What I also like is the comments you've made. You're really making it, as Michael said, about the system broad-based. Because I think there's three critical parts to this. The one that everybody will focus on, and it's very, very important, is how do we accelerate? What are the policies? What are the approaches? What do we have to do to accelerate the opportunity for innovation and competitiveness, especially when we think of things like Internet of Things, AI, all the rest? That's not enough. And that's where I think you've all hit on it. Michael hit it on early. You also have to be able to sustain it. And at the sustaining level, that gets back into the education system, that gets back into, like we talked last evening, whether it be infrastructure, whether it be the debt. There's a lot of other parts of this element. They're not the focus, but they still have to be about sustaining it. And I think the opportunity for your leadership is really on the first part, but also on the third part. And the third part is don't create impediments. And I do think as we think about this, it's not going to be easy to think about what are all the things that we ought to really focus on to drive this task forward. But I think it will be even more complex for people to think, and what are the things we got to make sure someone doesn't do or someone doesn't create in terms of a barrier that prevent us in this initiative from moving forward. So there's how do we accelerate this from a commission standpoint? How do we sustain it in terms of broad-based policies that allow it to continue to move forward? The third, it's also about how do we assure that somebody doesn't put in place an impediment that keeps us from moving forward. And you know, the importance of this right now, I don't think can be overemphasized, both in terms of a lot of the technology, especially things like AI, how quickly it's rapidly evolving, and the belief that many people have that this is the next, in fact, impact as much as the internet that it potentially could have. Added to the fact that for those of us that get to spend some time in China, we know they have this in their crosshairs. And they actually have, I mean, they came out of their Congress with this as a given. And so they will be focused as a country on trying to create their policies that will allow them to innovate and drive competitiveness in an even more accelerated fashion. So I just applaud all of you for taking this one on.
Thank you. Who would like to?
Yeah, I might kind of build on that. You know, if you say you want to really do something different, and I think, you know, at the systematic level, one of the things that we see as we look at how quickly emerging technologies are being adopted, you know, there's a drumbeat in various parts of the system, as you call it, around what do these technologies mean in terms of talent. And I think that people sometimes believe there's an inherent threat associated with the deployment of things like artificial intelligence or advanced robotics and cognitive that says, well, wait a minute, are we going to actually displace our workforce? The fact of the matter is, these technologies are actually going to optimize our workforce. You know, our research shows that in the next 10 years, we're going to need 4.6 million manufacturing jobs, and over half of those will go unfilled because we don't have the right skilled labor in place. That problem isn't going to change. You can chip away at it, but you can't profoundly change it. But when you look at the ability to deploy new technologies to optimize a workforce, right? You know, think about the notion of augmented reality and virtual reality and mixed reality, where you can train greater numbers of people at different levels of skill to perform complex tasks remotely. That you can actually have a center of expertise around a complicated item, and you can actually coach that person in the field or in the production facility on how to fulfill a task without advanced training. I mean, these technologies and creating the environment to grow and innovate these technologies is actually a key to raise society, quite candidly, as we look at these talent shortages. And I think that this commission, you know, this venue is the ideal one to raise that issue up to the national conversation level. Because again, if you sort of take a look at talent, and if you look at, we do a manufacturing competitive index every year. Every year, talent is the #1 issue that is an obstacle to competitiveness. Number 3 is workforce productivity, right? So I think kind of embracing these two as part of the commission's charter would actually be quite valuable, and I think it really changed the game around the dialogue that we're having as a group.
I think the general positive approach is something that we're going to do as opposed to defensive. It's all offense. And how do we grow the economy from 100 trillion to 200 trillion without getting people to laugh about that? That's not a laughable thing. That's actually completely possible. So.
That's right. I'd
Kyoki.
be happy to jump in. So first of all, we started off talking about the things that are effectively a drag, right? And I'd like to think about the things that, I'm an aerospace engineer, so thrust and lift. And you know, we just landed Monday the InSight probe on the surface of Mars. Incredible accomplishment. And we love to talk about these scientific achievements, but we often don't think about the key infrastructure that was put in place over decades to make these kinds of accomplishments possible. When I was a young grad student, I got to stand up at the top of the Pad 39A at Cape Canaveral with the space shuttle there, 15 stories up, you know, looking out across the Florida landscape. And first of all, it makes you feel very small. Second, it really imprints on you how important this infrastructure, this complex and massive infrastructure is to make these accomplishments possible. So if we're going to talk about driving science and technology to increase productivity, to increase accomplishment, to increase the opportunities for our workforce. We need to think about some of those less sexy things, that infrastructure that needs to be put in place. And we have been living off of investments that were made, in some cases, generations ago, and we are eating our seed corn today.
So you're talking about broadly infrastructure, including
So-
public infrastructure.
So when you think about shovel-ready roads, bridges, ports, we need to be talking about infrastructure in the broad sense. It's got to be things like our national laboratories, NIST, NASA, the service laboratories under DOD, and of course then the broader industry and academic infrastructure as well. And we talk a lot, and it's in the clarion call, about the underinvestment over many years. Less than half the buildings in our national laboratories now deemed adequate for their mission purposes. 80% of NASA's infrastructure now beyond its design life. But today, infrastructure means something even more than buildings, roads, facilities on the ground, laboratories. And so just think about space, right? One of our national laboratories actually is the International Space Station. But think about all those capabilities from GPS that enables you to do things like geodesy and continental drift measurement to measuring the solar system. These are the kinds of things that are our new infrastructure and need continued investment. And it's beyond that to think about digital transformation that we're all doing in our industries today. That same digital transformation is an investment we need in the infrastructure for our science and technology as well. An interesting article in the Wall Street Journal last week, and it was talking about open source software as essentially a core component of innovation, of the infrastructure for innovation for our country going forward, and the need to reform how we do federal funding of grants to allow for the maintenance of that new infrastructure. So we need to be thinking about the infrastructure of science and technology with this commission in a much more broad and holistic fashion to encompass not the buildings and the things that we had in the past, but what is infrastructure for the next 50 years to enable science and technology to drive productivity growth, economic growth, and ultimately the development of the nation.
So let's turn build on the national labs question. Paul, I've always said this at PepsiCo, that scientists tend to be some of the worst marketers. And the national labs, in my mind, are one of the best kept secrets that we have. I didn't get to appreciate this till much later in my career, certainly not as a graduate student. And yet there's huge opportunity of all the discoveries, the contributions, as well as the opportunity for the public-private partnerships and how to bridge those inventions to become true societal innovations. I've always looked at that is the transformation. Do you want to speak to what is possible and what we can do moving forward? Sure. As well as convert you to a marketer.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and make some comments as well. I think, first of all, I appreciate the comments about infrastructure, also about talent and accelerating, basically, that's already been offered by the panel members. I think those are all very appropriate when we talk about the national laboratories and realizing the value from the investment the nation has made in the national laboratories. I think it's important to note that our national research infrastructure, our national labs and our academic institutions are are really world-class, really world standards. Many countries are envious of what we're able to do in terms of our research capabilities and ability to deliver very progressive and life-changing technologies. And so I need to say that as well to start. But I think I'm encouraged with a couple of new models that we're actually in discussion at this point in time. And one really is focused on bringing together the intellectual hub really needed to drive development of quantum information science and quantum technologies, if you will. A brand new initiative really set up in the last 2 years across government as well as within the national laboratories and the universities as well. And so we're encouraged by that. It brings together nicely the academic community, the national laboratories, industry's already engaged. And really we need to think about how we actually build more actively, I think, really an educational component into that effort. And so really one idea that's been tried, which I think is a great thought in terms of standing things up more effectively, is actually having graduate students that have an advisor from industry as well as from the academic community, basically to really drive their thinking. So they're really, if you will, focused on a great problem. I think another great example we have underway at the National Laboratories is really a focus on how we move from discovery to impact much more quickly, how we actually use the great tools, the great scientific tools we have, whether it be an advanced photon source at Argonne or a leadership computing facility at Livermore, to really help us understand materials and how we might more quickly move them into the commercial marketplace. And so I think there are many things that we could do that really would knit more closely together industry, academia, the labs, and also government needs to be a part of that.
So, Chad, you know, you've been a systems level person forever. You know, working in a company that has a global perspective, obviously has a very, if you don't know the company, I mean, it has a very broad view of the future, thinking about future outcomes. There's no climate change denying in your company. Nor has there been for a long time, and a range of other things. That is, there's a full awareness of at a broad scope. So what do you think is the best approach for the commission to get at some of the things that we're talking about and not end up with just another, you know, we need to increase funding and enhance this and enhance that, because I don't think that's the pathway here.
Well, I couldn't agree more with your premise that you need a different pathway if you expect a different answer. So maybe I could focus on the energy system. I think if you look back over time and you say for a country to be competitive, you need a competitive energy system. And that's very much true as we go forward. There are many unanswered questions, but I've got three that I know the answer to. So let me give you the three answers I know, what I call three knowns. The energy system in the world will have a massive transition in this century. And 20% of the century is already gone. The only real question is, will it happen in the first half of the century, which will eliminate the greatest impacts of global warming, or will it be in the second half of the century and it won't? But it's going to happen, and everything we're planning in Shell assumes that. And the only issue is the timing. This is such a massive transition, it's really hard to describe. But if you think about if we're on that track for the first half of the century, in 2050, you will not be able to buy a new car with an internal combustion engine anywhere in the world. This is just a drastic, and when you've got 45,000 filling stations, you got to think about that, because what are they going to sell? So this is a big impact to what's going on. Now we have one carbon capture and storage system, we'll need 20. We have one major offshore windmill, we'll need 200. It's just a massive change in the system. So that's a given. Given number two is a lot of people think we cannot deal with the so-called hard-to-abate segments, steel, cement, plastics, transportation, air transportation. And we've just completed a study with the Energy Transition Commission, just issued a couple weeks ago, and we said, yes, we can. Even with today's technology, it will cost about 5 cents more on a $5 piece of goods. So yes, there's a little bit more cost with today's technology, but we certainly can make the change. And I think the third thing we know is the current level of technology is not enough to pull the world. If we don't have either a major policy shift or a different step in technology, the world will not make it on that fast track. So with that, the one thing I would suggest to the Commission is look at how we take the lead in developing that technology in this country. Right now we have a clear competitor, China. The Clarion Call makes this very clear. They've decided they're going to take the lead in multiple ways, not just technology development, and it's up to us to take that lead, and I think that'll be really high priority in the work.
So let me, to be provocative, you raised something there. You have these tens of thousands of filling stations with tens of thousands of jobs.
There's no G on that word, it's just filling.
Filling. I better get that right. There's the brake shops, the oil change stations, all of these, infrastructure and workers. What do we have to do to prepare? Because if I'm hearing what we've just heard around technology, around innovation, there's a part of our society today, for good or for bad, interpret that as have and have not. Some moving ahead, others getting left behind. What is it we have to think about? Because if it's not equitable and inclusive, we're going to create a different challenge. And that's sort of been the narrative to date. And this is open to anybody.
So if you just take the 45,000 stations, by the way, which is more outlets than McDonald's has or Starbucks has. It's a lot of these things. You got to repurpose them. There's some really nice locations. What else do you want to do in that location besides pump gas? Well, I do want to charge your car very fast. I want to charge your car fast enough that you can come in, get a sandwich, a cup of coffee, and then be back on the road. And we're doing that today. And if you're going to have hydrogen propelling your car, we're going to have a hydrogen system for you. And we'll probably have a solar cell on top of the station to create the hydrogen right there. But then what else can we do for the consumer because we're at that location? So that's the question. So if we could repurpose those employees that are now changing your oil to do whatever that new function is a very natural step.
Is our education system ready to train them?
Our education system is generally ready to adapt to the future. I think our education system at the university level hasn't been able to figure out how to deal with the issue of scale or the issue of what I call wreckage. Wreckage is the 31 million people in the United States who went to college and never finished, who sit out there unhappy and resentful about the fact that they don't have the process or a pathway to their perception of what it takes to get into the American dream. We've got to find ways educationally to accelerate our innovation to become more efficient while becoming better at the same time. I don't know this notion. We've got to find a way to make certain that all forms of education are equally valued. That a technical education, a vocational education, a college education, these things can't be classist as they are now. They're now blue collar, white collar, actual colors assigned to people based on their educational pathways. We've got to break down this notion of elitism to the extent that we can. There's forms of innovation that help to be able to do that. We have to become engaged in higher levels of democratization in our educational system. We also have to stop producing a million high school dropouts every year, which is what we're doing now. So we're producing 1 million high school dropouts every year. There are no new jobs for high school dropouts. There are no opportunities for employment or forward motion, and so we've got to really accelerate our ability to innovate. We have to find a way to defeat what's called Baumol's law, which is without the introduction of technology, the costs of all face-to-face services rise infinitely. And so we haven't figured out how to do that yet in education. And we have to figure out how to do that. That's what's going on in healthcare. That's what's going on in education. So we've got to find ways to take on all of those things. I think that what one has to do is find innovators, work with the innovators, show the way, and move forward.
Jim, given the work you have led in your company around understanding the sort of the pulse of the individual person out there and thinking about some of these challenges, share some of your observations and your thoughts around a number of these questions. And then the second would be, how do we leverage these capabilities moving forward?
I was thinking about something that Michael said in his opening remarks, but I think the commission needs to be careful what our North Star is. If our North Star is just innovation, this will have zero success. The North Star is GDP growth. And then you got to ask yourself, what role does innovation play in that? GDP is coming out for the third, it must have just come out right now. I don't know if it grew 3% or what, but this morning's when they announced it. But I think the world's GDP is about 100 trillion, maybe 90 or something like that. Ours is 20. But a good way, I think, for the commission to look at this is another 100 trillion will come in over just the next 10 or 12. The world GDP growth is decelerating right now. And I think this has to do with national security, not to sound like too paranoid, but I'm sure it does. Who gets the next 100 trillion? And so if you want to know who rules the world, remember let's call him Emperor Xi, it's pretty clear, because he said we'll be the dominant, the economic center of the world will be right here in Beijing and Shanghai and that kind of thing, unless we get more of that 100 trillion than they did. But I think that the commission has to point itself at that. I want to just say, what's the number that we're going for? The number that we're going for is 2.5% for this, if this was a company, if America was a company, is break even. GDP growth, so we'll hear what happened today. We've been averaging 1.7 since the meltdown. We've been going broke for 10 years, even though this will be our third good quarter. Excuse me. 3% we're winning. If you want to beat China, the best time we've ever had was between 1850 and 1950. We overwhelmed the world, dominated the world economically, which allowed us to dominate it and everything else. During 1850 and 1950, remember, this is winning. This is Ohio State beating Michigan 80-0 or something like that. I don't know why I said that one. But it's football season.
The University of Michigan president is in the room.
Somewhere
Oh,
here. Can't see him, but
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. But 80-0 is just 3 3/4. If we grow at 3 3/4, remember China's decelerating, we'll blow them away and we'll beat them on the 100 trillion. I think we got to aim everything at that. Mahmoud, I wanted to say something about what you said. I've lived here in Washington for 20 years. The stuff, the inventions that come out of this city and the federal government are so awesome. National labs and DARPA, what's going on over there? Nobody can mess with that. The only thing Chinese can do is keep stealing it. Here's the danger. That innovation on its own, GPS, internet, whatever all the great stuff is, it has no value at all until somebody creates a customer. Have you ever seen the show, they need to up my medication, but man.
I can do that too.
Man, yeah, he gives me shots. But Man in the High Tower, is that it? Has anybody seen that show? Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. But it's where we lose World War II. And they give half the United States to the Nazis and the other half to Japan. And it's a show about how they treat us and come in and take over our cities. It's so frightening, I can't watch it. My wife watches it, but I can't. How do you have that happen? It's where you just have more and more and more and more and more innovation and no customers. What if China steals our innovation and they start the companies? So we're doing a great job with innovation. Millennials, this is the part I had to say all that to get to this, don't start companies. They're a wonderful group of people. They're going to be great employees and all of that. We have a whole generation of kids that can't fire the innovation. But I think the commission's got to address that. And Michael, they can be those dropouts too. Yep. I mean, if you look at all this great internet stuff, those are dropouts. I've got to figure out which ones they are. But I want to just tell you one little story, then I'll stop. And I've told probably half the audiences, and it's the most profound story I've heard since I moved here. But the guy that invented the internet, a lot of you know him as Wince-Smith, and Bob Kahn. They are the Wright brothers. They got lift. They got packets to fly across fiber optics. So that's what Washington does. They invented the internet. The military had it, General, for defense and all that kind of stuff. Who knew that thing was there? Vint told me this story privately, just with wives. It's a true story. Al Gore came over because he liked technology so much, and he said, I heard you have this thing. I guess it was at that time all top secret. Vint showed him what they had made, how these guys send this stuff all around. It blew Al Gore's mind. He said to Vint, this is a perfect example of our problem, and it's so fixable. And Vince is one of the most important Americans of the last 200 years. But Al Gore said to him, can I throw this out into commerce and see what businesses can do with it? Wince-Smith said back to him, and he's given me permission to say this, but Wince-Smith said back to him, go ahead, but I don't see what value it'll have. You know, if you're just going to give an MVP to somebody you don't hear much about, think of the clarion call moment that Al Gore had. What if that thing was sitting there and that's what the Chinese stole? What if the Chinese would have stolen what Bob Kahn and Vint Cerf made and they build out the internet? That man in the high tower story would be true. The point is that we need to keep innovating, national labs and all that stuff coming out. We need to keep having that Al Gore moment. How are we going to commercialize this? Innovation, what we're doing is very, very intentional. Good luck on anybody catching us with that. The part that fires it, the commercialization, the entrepreneurship, the builders and all that remains random. And I think we can fix that.
So maybe we have 10 minutes or so left. Maybe what we should do is, for everybody that's up here, let's go back to this. I think this has been very good input, and we'll certainly go back and take a look at it in terms of framing exactly how the commission will go forward. But what's the one unusual thing that you want to make sure that the commission addresses beyond something that you've already said? What just something that it's this sort of, I wish somebody had looked at this stuff. So what we were just hearing from Jim, you know, this notion of I think it was Governor Bush who said, if I could get two numbers to work, 4% economic growth and 2% immigration, I can make the United States economy hum and be successful across all competitors and all. It's basically your numbers that you just articulated, Jim. You know, so this focus on economic competitiveness and GDP, that's something that we just heard. What are some other things like that in short form? We'll just start at the end and come this direction.
Yeah, sure. You know, look, I mean, you sort of, your opening remarks were great because, like, you know, how do we create something that's not just going to kind of gather dust and look great with a binder? And, you know, I will say this, and I would challenge the commission to, you know, kind of really begin to tap into, you know, kind of other areas of knowledge that are going to provide insight into what you're doing. So a great example is, you know, I would encourage us to say, like, look, maybe we should crowdsource some of our analysis to actually see kind of what is available to us as insight from our general populace, right? And by the way, if they happen to be in interesting voting districts, all the better, right? But I do think that, you know, starting to introduce the voices of those who have not been heard on this topic before could actually be something quite remarkable, and right, and quite intentional. And I would suspect that we'll begin to get insights from that perhaps are not just locked up in our academic institutions.
So broaden the input, move out, crowdsource some of that. We've talked about that as one of the things that we would do. In fact, that's something we talked about.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah. Okay.
Paul? I would jump in again on the quantum information science. I think we have a real opportunity. There's a current law pending. It looks like the House and Senate are actually going to pass the National Quantum Initiative. It's a real opportunity for us to continue a march really towards supremacy in terms of quantum technologies, whether it be quantum communications, quantum sensors, quantum computing. Really key to that, I think, is really a model that's already underway in terms of Microsoft, IBM, are putting early generation, if you will, of quantum computing out and making it available so that much to the idea of crowdsourcing. Let's let folks try it. Let's get some feedback in. Let's really develop it based upon that feedback and really drive innovation in that way. So early access to developing or promising technologies, I would say, is a great way to really drive innovation, accelerate it much more quickly than we do today.
So one of the things that we have to do is we have to get people to understand that what ubiquitous, unlimited computational power can actually do for economic transformation, because I don't think that that's generally understood what that can do. So, Sam?
I'm going to take off from where Jim Clifton was. You know, I think if I was going to add something right now, I'd say the commission, it's going to be really important that as you present the information, that we're able to connect the dots in a simplistic way and that there is an end game. Jim made it very easy. You know, if you say 3 3/4% GDP growth, or if you say 4, here's why you have to have it. Now here are the 5 steps, and here's how they're connected to get there. I think we can be sometimes guilty of we got to do X, Y, and Z, but we don't show how they're connected. And as a result, there's not a compelling call to action for the majority of the populace. And this can't be something that ends up just being a document for this town. I think you've got to be able to create a rallying cry that is broad-based. So I would encourage the commission to really focus not only on the deep thinking of what needs to be done, but then on how do we articulate it in a manner that the majority of the populace can fully appreciate and buy into as a call to action.
Okay.
I'd just say we got to couch this in terms of how can we create overmatch. If you look at what's going on in the world, we are very much in a competition, as Jim said. It is a fight. It is a race. And so we need to be setting the bar not where we've been, but out ahead. Second, if you look at what's going on in our economy today, essentially discretionary spending, is being driven to a fraction that's equivalent to zero over the long term. And so we cannot invest in, we've eaten the seed corn, essentially. We need to change that trajectory and change it fast. And so the things that I would like us to see are really understand holistically where we need to make those long-term infrastructure investments for the future, figure out what are the new models for authorizing, appropriating, long-term funding these long-term investments, and then figure out what we can do in the short term. We may well have an opportunity in the next Congress for a new infrastructure bill. Let's get into that infrastructure bill, some of the down payments on that future infrastructure for science and technology for our nation.
One thing worth noting as you were talking, I was just imagining even the design and the structure of Congress is very 18th century, 19th century, in the sense of it is functional as opposed to objective driven. It's functionally driven. So you have compartments and pockets. There are no competitiveness committees per se and groups that are focused on the attainment of certain numbers. And so we might spend a little time at least commenting on that also.
So if I might just, one of the ways to think about it, and before I hand over to Chad, we've got to move away from thinking about this simply as physical infrastructure investment to capability infrastructure investment. And I think the mindset historically has been physical infrastructure and asset building. And we're moving to a world where it's capability building. And our system hasn't yet figured out how to transform everything from planning to our investment thesis, and it's got to start here.
But part of that race is the people. And how do we continue to be that magnet for the best and brightest, where countries like China have active programs, 1,000 scientists, to pull those best and brightest away from the U.S.
Chad?
Again, I'm very encouraged by what you're doing. And you may approach this and say, if we could double the pace of play, that would be great. I think it needs to be 10x. So I think that the speed we'll have to move to beat China will be an order of magnitude greater than you can probably imagine today. Second, decide now who the customer is for this work. Decide what form that customer wants to receive this and what are their requirements so you meet your customer requirements. I would focus on customers less than 25 years old because I think if we can get to that group under 25, you can change the country.
Jim, as we wrap up here, a couple of things for you to think about and share. You actually said nothing happens until you have a customer. There's the customer for developing the capability, but ultimately as businesses, we have global customers, and we have to think as global organizations. So in this narrative, we have to dance this, go across this fine line behind building our own competitiveness and leading, but yet bringing our global customers along with us, because in isolation, we're going to be representing 300 million out of 9 billion by 2050. We've got to be able to balance that. So your thoughts on that, and talk a little bit about the initiative that you're going to lead with the Commission.
Well, Mahmoud, I don't think we got to get immigration right. And when I say immigration, I'm not talking about what's going on at the border in Mexico. I'm talking about there are people born that are very unusual. They can build big companies that other people can't. Now, we just did a study of the, they take the Inc. 500 fastest growing companies. Those are really valuable Americans. You really need those. We got 2 years of them, and we had some Gallup psychologists go through. Their neuron configuration is different. There's no two sides to it. But their development's really important. You look at Steve Jobs. What's he worth? That company's worth about $1 trillion. It's what one guy did is worth more than whole countries. We don't think that way about it. But anyway, my point was on the 1,000 Inc. 500, that's what we need to trigger all this innovation. 60% of them are immigrants. Again, I'm not talking about the border. We got to make sure they get here. Steve Jobs' dad was a Syrian. If Steve Jobs' dad wouldn't have moved here, Steve would have been a Syrian, hell, nothing would have happened. You got to be in this country to get these explosions. And so the whole world would have missed that fantastic thing. It's the immigrants or the kids of immigrants. So you see, Steve's technically the son of an immigrant. But if we had a global, my answer to this is that if we had a global dragnet looking for them like we do for high IQ kids, for all those people want to get into the schools, the Chinese and Koreans and everything else. We need to start that same system, but for people with this. Remember, none of these guys get through college. Google and Bill Gates and everything else. They have so much energy, so much determined, so much drive. But we got to figure out who they are and then get them into our system. And then we've got to sell more. We've got to produce more. Our GDP per capita, and we've been doing it. We're fading a little bit now, but we've got to your point, Mahmoud, we've got to make more and sell more. We can't do it enough with us because there's only 300, I think this is your point, 330 million of us or something. But so we've got to outproduce the whole world and just sell a whole bunch of stuff. We can do that, but we've got to make this sort of the New York Yankees for the whole world. If you can hit a ball farther than anybody else, we want you here. But we got to have some way where we go out. Maybe we could have the military go out and capture them and do an airlift and get. But we've got an advantage. I'll just end with this because I was on a panel in Chamonix, France, and it was all Europeans. There weren't many Americans. God, they hate Americans. I mean, just everybody gets up, everybody's smart, and they got a new way of why. One thing was about the end of America, and you sit there as an American and you think, geez, I had no idea it was this bad. But anyway, they said, you can have the last word. And so it was a Chinese leader, I won't say his name, and a French leader, I won't say his name. And they just magnificently took down America. But I said to him, I want you to consider this. Gallup has a world poll. We built consistent sampling frames across 160 countries, which gets you 98% of the population. We asked 98% of the population, do you plan to leave your country permanently? We didn't say you're going to take, you see what I mean? Are you going to get the hell out of your country? A third of the world says, I plan on doing that. And that's not just Russia, it's not just, I don't know, Ecuador or somewhere. That's Germany, that's France. And then the next question is, where are you going? What's the dream? Where do you want to go? What do you think their answer is? They hate the Yankees, they hope we lose and everything else, but at the end of the day, they'd give anything to be a Yankee. Because they say, my dream is to get to the United States of America. We have an untapped asset that if you just follow the media and everything else, it looks like they all hate us. You say, what are we going to do at the border? We got 8,000 or some tiny number. There's only 12 million, and now it's down to 10 million. The immigration problem's not as bad as you think it is. But you have about, I don't know, what would that be, 500 million people that every day they get up, they're thinking, I wonder how I could get there. But if we could sort through and find all the Steve Jobs, we would win the war.
Well, look, thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of our panelists. Great input. We have a daunting task, Michael and I, and You can count on us picking everybody's brains consistently. We are just acting as the facilitators for this, Sam.
And we're going to be coming back to all of you out there.
And we're going to, as Michael said, our plan is to get out and not only get input from this room, but Jim didn't have a chance to touch on this, but we're delighted that Jim and Gallup have taken on an initiative to actually get a finger of the pulse and get input from a much broader audience to help guide us and get us input on that. And very grateful for you and your organization stepping up in helping us do that. Because without that perspective, we won't get people on board. So thank you very much. We'll hand over to the voice of God, or the surrogate for the voice of God, Deborah. All right.